Al Simmons had died more times than most men had drawn breath. Death was no longer a threshold, it was a revolving door, a cruel joke authored by powers far older than human understanding. And hell, that ancient architect of suffering, had grown tired of its most defiant soldier. Spawn stood in the throne room of Male Bulger, chains of living necroplasm coiling around his armored form like serpents made of midnight and rage. The demon lord's face twisted with something between fury and fascination, its voice a chorus of screaming souls compressed into syllables. "You were supposed to be my general," Male Bulger hissed, his words dripping like molten iron onto cold stone. "My weapon, my perfect instrument of damnation." Spawn's eyes, those hollow, burning voids where humanity once resided, fixed on the demon with absolute contempt. "I was never yours." The throne room shuddered, not from physical force, but from the weight of defiance itself. In Hell's economy of souls, rebellion was currency, and Spawn had just declared bankruptcy on the entire system. Male Bulger rose, his form expanding until it filled the vaulted darkness above, a mountain of flesh and fury and ancient malice. "Then you are nothing, less than nothing, a mistake I will unmake." But as the demon lord reached down with claws that could rend reality, something else reached back. The warp does not ask permission. It tore through Hell's fabric like a scalpel through rotted silk wound in existence itself, screaming colors that had no names, geometries that violated sanity's architecture. Spawn felt the pull immediately, a gravity that transcended physics, a hunger that made Hell's appetite seem quaint by comparison. Male Bulger recoiled, his throne cracking beneath him. "What have you done?" "Nothing," Spawn said, and for the first time in centuries he almost smiled. But something noticed. The rift expanded, and hell itself, that eternal dominion of suffering, began to fracture. Demons scattered like roaches before light, but this was not light. This was something older, something that remembered when darkness was the only thing that existed, before even hell learned to harvest pain. Spawn's necroplasmic symbiote screamed, its consciousness alien and primal, sensing danger beyond its comprehension. The cape thrashed, trying to anchor its host to this dimension, but the pull was absolute. Irresistible. "No." Male Bulger lunged, desperation replacing fury. A demon lord afraid. It should have been impossible, but the impossible was happening. Spawn felt himself unraveling, molecule by molecule, his essence stretched across dimensions like a soul on a rack. He had endured torture, betrayal, death, and damnation. He had burned in Hell's furnaces and walked through valleys where hope went to die. This was different. This was the sensation of falling upward, of drowning in a sea made of screaming mathematics, of being devoured by something so vast that hell itself was merely a footnote in its appetite. The last thing Spawn heard before the warp consumed him completely was Male Bulger's voice, diminished and distant, carrying an emotion Al Simmons had never heard from his tormentor before. Then there was nothing but the scream. Not his scream. The scream of reality itself, bent around impossible angles, twisted through spaces where physics wept and gave up, colors that tasted like copper, sounds that had texture. Time moved sideways, then inside out, then ceased to move at all while simultaneously accelerating toward heat death. Spawn's consciousness fragmented. He saw himself from outside, from inside, from angles that didn't exist. He witnessed his own death in Botswana, felt Wanda's tears, experienced his daughter's laughter, all happening simultaneously across timelines that branched like neural pathways in some cosmic brain. The warp cared nothing for his history. It was a storm that had raged since before stars learned to burn, and he was merely debris caught in its eternal howling. How long the passage lasted was meaningless. Seconds could have been millennia. Eternity could have been a heartbeat. When coherence finally returned, when the screaming colors resolved into something resembling sensory input, Al Simmons spawned the hellbound soldier who had defied demons and death itself opened his eyes. He was floating. Not in hell's sulphurous caverns. Not in the alleys of New York where his war had been waged. He drifted in a space that was not space, surrounded by an ocean of souls that writhed and screamed and laughed and wept all at once. There. The warp. The sea of souls. He didn't know these names yet, but his symbiote alien consciousness fused to his resurrected flesh recoiled with instinctive terror. It recognized this place the way prey recognizes the scent of an apex predator. This was not hell. This was something that made hell look like a children's story told to keep mortals afraid of the dark. Spawn's necroplasm began to coil defensively, forming patterns it had never formed before, responding to threats it couldn't see but could feel pressing against his existence from every direction simultaneously. Something was watching him. Many somethings. Hungry, ancient beyond measurement. In the distance, though distance had no meaning, here shapes moved through the psychic storm. Massive. Purposeful. They hadn't noticed him yet, but they would. Spawn had been cast out of hell. He had defied the lords of damnation and survived. But as he floated in that impossible sea, feeling the weight of eternal hunger pressing against his soul from every direction, Simmons understood with terrible clarity. He had not escaped damnation. He had merely found a universe where damnation was so absolute, so institutionalized, so utterly complete that hell itself would seem like mercy by comparison. And somewhere in the churning madness of the warp, something that might have been laughter echoed through dimensions he couldn't perceive, as if the universe itself was savoring the irony. A soul already condemned, cast into a realm where condemnation was the natural state of existence. The storm began to move. And Spawn, for the first time since his resurrection, felt something he thought hell had burned out of him forever: uncertainty. The warp does not dream, but if it did, Spawn would have been a nightmare it couldn't wake from. He drifted through currents of screaming psychic energy, his form a dark wound against the storm's impossible colors. The Immaterium churned around him, emotions given substance, thoughts given flesh, madness given eternal life. And then they came. Demons poured from the psychic tide like sharks scenting blood in water. Lesser entities, first gibbering horrors with too many mouths, living geometries that violated sanity, creatures composed entirely of spite and hunger given temporary form. They rushed him with the confidence of predators who had never known anything but prey. The first demon reached Spawn with claws extended, its form a writhing mass of eyes and teeth and sounds that could drive mortals mad. It lunged for his essence, seeking to tear, to consume, to add his soul to the eternal feast. Spawn's chains moved, not defensively, not with hesitation. They exploded outward with a speed that transcended the warp's fluid physics, living weapons forged from necroplasm and rage, and something the Immaterium had never encountered before. The chains didn't just pierce the demon, they devoured it. The creature's scream cut short, not banished, not dispersed back into the warp to reform. Gone. Utterly. Permanently. Erased from existence with a finality that violated the warp's fundamental nature. The other demons hesitated. For entities born from the sea of souls who knew that death was merely temporary, who had existed since mortal emotions first crystallized into consciousness. This pause was unprecedented. Spawn rotated slowly in the psychic storm, his cape spreading like wings of living darkness, his eyes burning with green fire that the warp recognized as something other. Something outside its rules. The demons attacked en masse. It was a massacre. Necroplasmic chains whipped through the Immaterium like a harvester through wheat, each strike erasing demons, not just from the present, but from the possibility of future existence. Spawn's symbiote, that alien consciousness, fed on their essence, growing stronger with each kill, adapting to this new environment with terrifying efficiency. A horror of TZNT. Its form composed of crystallized lies and impossible futures, tried to manipulate probability around Spawn, to rewrite the narrative of this encounter. The chains caught it mid-incantation and compressed it into nothing. Fate itself hiccuped. A plague-bearer of Nurgle, its flesh dripping with entropy and blessed decay, lunged forward with diseases that could rot reality. Spawn's necroplasm consumed it, and the diseases died impossibly, irreversibly died, their cycles broken, their eternal nature negated. A bloodletter of Khorne, brass armor gleaming with rage crystallized into material form, swung its hellblade with the strength of 1 billion wars. The blade shattered against Spawn's armor. The bloodletter followed moments later, devoured by darkness that cared nothing for martial honor or the glory of slaughter. The warp rippled with confusion. This was wrong. Demons were eternal. They could be banished, dispersed, temporarily destroyed, but they always returned, reformed from the emotional energies that birthed them. The Sea of Souls could not forget its children, but Spawn was making it forget. Each demon he killed left a void in the warp, a silence where there should have been eventual rebirth. The Immaterium tried to fill these voids, to restore what had been lost, but the necroplasm had consumed not just the demon's forms but their fundamental existence. Hell's magic operated by different rules than the warp's psychic physics. Where they intersected, reality didn't know which laws to obey, so it simply broke. Spawn continued to drift, his path through the sea of souls marked by absence-empty spaces where demons had been, wounds in the warp that wouldn't heal. And in their distant domains, impossible palaces built from concepts given architecture, the Chaos Gods took notice. Khorne, the blood god, felt the deaths of his demons and roared with something between rage and confusion. This being killed with such efficiency, such brutal finality, but offered no skulls to the throne, no worship to war itself. The rage was pure but directionless, power without devotion. It offended the blood god's fundamental nature. Sint, the architect of fate, observed the anomaly with 999 crystalline eyes, and saw nothing. The threads of fate around this being were not cut, they simply didn't exist. Every possible future the changer of ways calculated collapsed into paradox when this entity was factored into the equation. Impossibility made manifest. It delighted and terrified the schemer in equal measure. Nurgle, grandfather of plagues, reached out with jovial curiosity to embrace this new soul in his garden, to show it the beauty of decay and the comfort of entropy. His gifts of disease and rot reached toward Spawn and simply stopped. You cannot rot what is already dead. You cannot decay what was forged in hell's furnaces. The Plague Lord withdrew, confused, his normally inexhaustible patience strained by something that rejected the gift of despair without even acknowledging it. And Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, tasted this being's emotions and found them simultaneously intoxicating and repulsive. Here was suffering elevated to art, damnation refined into purpose, but it offered no excess, no ecstasy, no indulgence. This being had transcended desire not through asceticism but through sheer concentrated spite. The Dark Prince shuddered with something that might have been arousal or revulsion, perhaps both simultaneously. The four entities regarded this anomaly, this impossibility that consumed their servants permanently, and reached a rare consensus. This being was a threat. Not to their immediate power, they were gods, after all, sustained by the emotions of countless trillions across the galaxy, but to the fundamental rules by which the great game was played, to the eternal cycles of the warp itself. Spawn had no idea he was being observed by powers that made Malbalja look like a minor functionary in suffering's bureaucracy. He simply continued to exist, to drift, to destroy anything that approached him with hostile intent. His symbiote pulsed with stolen power, gorged on demonic essence, adapting to this new realm with predatory efficiency. The warp churned around him, and for the first time in its timeless existence, the Sea of Souls felt something like indigestion. Hell had met the warp, and the warp was discovering it had competition. The hive world of Tertium Prime had been dying for 3 weeks, and its death was brutally efficient. Chaos had come not with subtlety but with the inevitability of rot claiming a corpse. Warp rifts opened like wounds in reality, vomiting forth demons and traitor legionnaires who remembered the Imperium they once served and hated it with the passion only betrayal can forge. The Imperial Guard died by the thousands. Commissars executed deserters. Priests screamed litanies until their throats bled. The PDF had shattered on the second day. The hive's lower levels were already lost. 2 billion souls surrendered to chaos, their screams fueling the very entities that devoured them. On the mid-hive plaza designated Defense Zone Sigma 7, Sergeant Andros Kine of the 44th Cadian Shock Troops watched the sky and knew, with the certainty soldiers develop when death becomes routine, that he would not see another dawn. His squad, what remained of it, held a barricade made of rubble and corpses. 18 men and women who had survived ambushes, artillery, demon incursions, and 3 days without sleep. They were professionals, veterans, and they were finished. Movement in the smoke, Corporal Feshen called out, her lasrifle steady despite the tremor in her voice. Kine raised his magnoculars. Through the haze of burning promethium and vaporized human remains, shapes moved. Too many shapes. Bloodletters of Khorne, their brass armor reflecting firelight, advance with the patient inevitability of a closing vice. Behind them something larger, a demon prince perhaps, or a greater demon. It didn't matter which, the result would be the same. Fix bayonets, Kine ordered, his voice calm. The Emperor protected, or so the priests claimed. But Kine had seen too many good soldiers die screaming to put much faith in divine intervention. They had no ammunition left for anything but a final volley. No support. No reinforcements. The Vox had been screaming static for 6 hours. The demons charged. Kine inhaled, preparing to give the order to fire, when the sky above defense zone Sigma-7 tore open. Not like the warp rifts, those festering wounds that leaked madness and demonic spite into reality. This was different. Violent. A gash in space that bled darkness itself. A wound that seemed to scream with the voices of every soul that had ever damned another. Something fell through. It hit the plaza between the guard position and the charging demons with enough force to crack the reinforced ferrocrete, sending shockwaves that knocked soldiers and demons alike off their feet. The impact crater smoked. For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. Then he rose. Kine had seen space marines before, those transhuman gods of war who strode through battlefields like legends given flesh. He had seen demon princes, reality's rules bent around their impossible forms. This was neither. The figure stood perhaps 7 feet tall, clad in armor that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. A tattered cape, no, not a cape, something alive, something that moved with predatory intelligence spread behind him like the wings of some infernal angel. Chains coiled around his armored form, writhing like serpents, their tips glowing with green fire. His eyes were hollow voids filled with emerald flame, and he looked at the charging demons with an expression Kine recognized immediately, because he'd felt it himself countless times in countless battles. Contempt. The bloodletters, creatures forged from rage itself, demon-born warriors who knew no fear, hesitated just for a moment. It was the only moment Spawn needed. He moved, not with the calculated precision of an Astartes or the supernatural speed of a demon. He moved like violence given purpose, like rage refined into perfect technique. The chains exploded outward, each one finding a target with impossible accuracy. A bloodletter, its hellblade raised for a killing strike, was caught mid-swing. The chain wrapped around its throat and yanked. The demon's head separated from its brass-armored body with a wet crunch that shouldn't have been possible. Demons didn't have flesh to tear, but Spawn's chains cared nothing for what should or shouldn't be. Another demon lunged from the side. The living cape lashed out, transforming into a forest of spikes that impaled the creature and lifted it skyward before slamming it into the ferrocrete with enough force to shatter both the ground and the demon's form. 3 bloodletters attacked in concert, a coordinated assault that should have overwhelmed any single opponent. Spawn didn't defend. He walked forward, letting their hellblades strike his armor, which drank the impacts and gave nothing back. Then his fists, glowing with necroplasmic energy, punched through brass armor and demonic essence alike. The bloodletters died. Not banished died. Their forms collapsed into ash that the wind scattered, leaving behind a silence where there should have been the potential for rebirth. In 47 seconds, the demon assault that would have overrun defense zone Sigma-7 ceased to exist. Spawn stood in the center of the plaza, surrounded by demon ash and cracked stone, his cape settling around him like a living shadow. He didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge the stunned Imperial guardsmen who stared at him from behind their barricade. He simply looked at them, his burning eyes sweeping across their positions, taking in their wounds, their exhaustion, their absolute shock. Then he turned and walked toward the hive's lower levels, toward the sounds of screaming and gunfire, toward the heart of the chaos invasion. Kine realized he'd been holding his breath. He exhaled shakily, his las rifle still aimed at the retreating figure. "What the hell was that?" Feshen whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Kine admitted. He opened the squad Vox, his hand trembling slightly as he keyed the transmission. "Command, this is Sigma-7. We just received assistance. Unknown entity. Extreme combat effectiveness. Neutralized demon assault. Requesting identification." And the Vox crackled to life. Not with orders or confirmation, but with a voice Kine had never heard before, cold, precise, carrying the authority of the Inquisition. "Sigma-7, mark your position and evacuate immediately. Do not engage the entity. Do not attempt communication. Imperial authority will handle this matter." The transmission cut off. Kine looked at his squad. They looked back at him, confusion and hope and fear mixing in expressions made hollow by weeks of constant warfare. Whatever that thing was, demon, Xenos, something worse yet had saved their lives. In a galaxy where the Emperor's servants died by the billions in his name, Where faith and duty demanded sacrifice unto death, something had intervened, something had chosen their survival. In the Imperium of man, where dogma was absolute and deviation was heresy, that choice was the greatest blasphemy imaginable. Salvation without the Emperor's blessing wasn't salvation at all. It was damnation wearing hope's mask. And as spawn descended into the hive's burning depths, leaving behind a squad of guardsmen who would spend the rest of their short lives trying to reconcile what they'd witnessed, the Imperium's vast machinery of faith and fury began to turn its attention toward this new impossibility. The Inquisition was coming. Inquisitor Cassian Voke arrived on Tertium Prime 12 hours after the first reports of the anomaly reached inquisitorial channels. He came with a retinue of 6 psykers, a squad of Tempestus Scions, 3 tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and a mandate signed in blood by the Ordo Malleus itself. His orders were clear: identify, classify, and eliminate. The Imperium had stood for 10,000 years on a foundation of absolute certainty. The Emperor protected. Chaos was the enemy. Faith was armor. Deviation was corruption. The entity currently butchering its way through chaos forces in Tertium Prime's lower hive violated every principle that certainty was built upon. Voke watched picked feeds from servo skulls in the command bunker. His augmetic eye processing data streams his organic brain couldn't fully comprehend. The footage showed a battleground that defied tactical analysis. Chaos cultists, their flesh warped by demonic gifts, charged the entity and were torn apart by animated chains. Demons greater and lesser alike materialized from warp rifts only to be caught and destroyed with a permanence that the tech priests claimed was theoretically impossible. A chaos sorcerer attempted to bind the entity with warpcraft, speaking names of power that could shatter minds and bend reality. The entity walked through the sorcerous assault as if it were merely inconvenient weather and crushed the sorcerer's skull with one armored hand. Psyker analysis, Voke commanded. The lead psyker, a woman whose name had been burned from records when she was inducted into the Inquisition's service, stepped forward. Her eyes were milky white, her consciousness partially submerged in the warp even now. "I cannot read it, my lord," she said, and her voice trembled with something Voke had never heard from her before: confusion. "It is not a blank eye can perceive it exists, but its soul, its essence, it's layered, shielded, not by psychic wards or nullfields, but by something else, something my training has no framework to comprehend." "Is it demonic?" Voke pressed. "It destroys demons with a thoroughness I have never witnessed. It does not banish them, it erases them, as if it consumes their fundamental existence." She paused, her blind eyes tracking movements only she could perceive. "But its power, it tastes of damnation, of hell, but not our hell, not the warp's corruption, something older, something that exists in parallel to chaos rather than as part of it." The tech priests interrupted with bursts of binaric cant. Voke's cogitator translated. "Armor composition defies material analysis. Energy signatures suggest technology that predates the Dark Age, or postdates it by parameters we cannot calculate. Probability of Xeno's origin, 34%. Probability of archaeotech, 41%. Probability of chaos corruption masquerading as alternative, 25%. Voke closed his organic eye, thinking. In his 30 years serving the Inquisition, he had faced cults, heretics, Xenos, and demons. He had ordered exterminatus twice. He had burned worlds to save sectors, but this was different. "Where is it now?" he asked. "Lower Hive, Sector 7 Gamma," a tactical officer reported. "Civilian refugees are following it. Approximately 40,000 people have evacuated from chaos-controlled territory in its wake." That detail struck Voke like a physical blow. "It's protecting them?" Footage suggests it engages any chaos forces that threaten civilian populations while largely ignoring Imperial military formations unless they fire upon it first. Voke opened his eye.
"Show me."
The primary screen shifted to a live feed. The entity they had taken to calling it the anomaly in official report stood in what had once been a residential district. Behind it, a crowd of civilians huddled, men, women, children, all bearing the hollow-eyed look of those who had seen damnation up close. A group of cultists emerged from a side corridor, their weapons raised. The anomaly's cape that living, writhing mass lashed out with such speed the picked feed could barely capture it. The cultists died. Not fell back, not retreated. Died, their bodies scattered across the corridor like broken toys. Then the entity did something that made Vok's blood run cold. It turned to the civilians and gestured. A simple motion, unmistakably clear. Follow. And they did. Without question. Without the hesitation that should have come from encountering something that looked like it had crawled from the warp's deepest nightmares. They followed it like they'd follow a protector. Emperor's mercy, Vok whispered. The ecclesiarchy representative in the command bunker, Cardinal Militant Severin, his robes stiff with purity seal, stepped forward, his face twisted with righteous fury. This is obscenity, Severin declared. These people look to this creature rather than the Emperor. They place their faith in a demon thing rather than prayer. They are saved by heresy rather than dying faithful. This is the greatest corruption, false hope. It's saving lives, one of the junior officers said before catching himself, realizing he'd spoken heresy aloud. Severin rounded on him. Salvation without faith is damnation. Better they die as martyrs than live as the tainted. This entity offers survival at the cost of their souls. Vok raised a hand, silencing the argument. What does it want? The question hung in the air. The psyker spoke, her voice distant. It wants nothing, no worship, no sacrifice, no souls for harvest. It simply acts as if morality exists independent of faith, as if protecting the innocent requires no doctrine. That was the heresy's core, Vok realized. Not that the entity was protecting people, the Imperium's warriors did that every day, but that it did so without invoking the Emperor, without demanding faith, without framing salvation as the rightful reward for belief. It suggested that humanity could be saved for its own sake, that mercy could exist without dogma. In a galaxy where the Imperium survived by demanding absolute faith from every citizen, where questioning the Emperor's divinity meant death, where the very architecture of civilization required believing humanity's worth came from service to the Golden Throne, this entity's existence was a loaded bolter aimed at the foundations. If people could be saved without the Emperor, why did the Emperor matter? If hope could exist without faith, why demand faith at all? Vok made his decision. Prepare containment protocols, he ordered. If containment fails, authorize lethal force. Tech priests, ready cyclonic torpedoes. If this entity cannot be controlled or destroyed conventionally, I will not hesitate to order exterminatus. Cardinal Severin smiled, satisfied. The psyker said nothing, but Vok saw tears on her blind face. In the lower hive, Spawn continued walking, unaware or uncaring that the Imperium's wrath was about to descend upon him. He had faced hell's judgment before. This would be no different. The assault came at midnight, though midnight meant nothing in the lower hive where the sun had never penetrated even before chaos claimed the depths. A warp rift opened with the sound of reality screaming, not a minor tear but a gaping wound 300 meters across, vomiting forth demon legions with the singular purpose of reclaiming what the dark gods believed was rightfully theirs. The chaos forces had concluded, through the twisted logic of the warp, that Spawn was a weapon, one of their own, perhaps lost, perhaps stolen, but ultimately a tool forged in damnation that rightfully belonged to the ruinous powers. They would reclaim him or destroy him, preferably reclaim. The first wave consisted of 200 bloodletters, their brass armor gleaming with reflected firelight, their hellblades singing with the promise of skulls for Khorne's throne. Behind them came horrors of TZNT, crystalline nightmares that rewrote probability with every gesture. Plague-bearers shuffled forward, their diseases so potent the very air rotted around them. And from the rift center emerged 6 soul grinders, demon engines, half machine and half warp Spawn, their cannons already charging with reality-bending ammunition. They found Spawn in a collapsed transit station, standing before 300 civilians who had nowhere left to run. The bloodletters charged with a roar that shook the foundations, that primal scream of rage given voice and form and terrible purpose. Spawn's chains exploded outward. What followed wasn't a battle, it was an exhibition in permanent extinction. The chains moved with intelligence beyond simple animation, each one a predator hunting prey, each strike calculated to not just kill but erase. A bloodletter was caught mid-charge, wrapped in necroplasmic links that constricted until the demon's brass armor crumpled like parchment. The demon screamed not in pain, but in existential terror as it felt itself being consumed. Not banished, consumed. Its essence fed directly into Spawn's symbiote, which pulsed with stolen power, adapting, growing stronger. The bloodletter vanished. Not dispersed back into the warp to eventually reform. simply ceased to exist, leaving a void in Khorne's legions that would never be filled. 10 demons died in the first 5 seconds, 20 more in the next 10. The bloodletters, creatures that knew no fear, that were literally born from the concept of martial rage, began to hesitate. The horrors of Tsinti attempted to intervene, their crystalline forms fracturing light and probability as they wove complex spells designed to trap Spawn in temporal loops, to rewrite his existence, to unmake him through paradox. Spawn walked through their magic like it was fog. His necroplasm didn't just resist the sorcery, it devoured it, consumed the warpcraft itself, and added its power to the symbiote's growing arsenal. A horror of Tsintesh, its 9 crystalline eyes, each seeing a different possible future, looked at Spawn and saw the same thing in every timeline, its own permanent death. It tried to flee, to shift through probability into a timeline where it had never engaged this anomaly. Spawn's cape, that living extension of his will, lashed out across dimensional barriers and caught the horror mid-transition. The demon's scream echoed across multiple timelines simultaneously as it was dragged back into the present and compressed into nothingness. Tsinchi, in his impossible crystal labyrinth, felt the death of one of his chosen servants and experienced something he hadn't felt in millennia: surprise. The future refused to account for this variable. Fate itself was breaking around this being. The plague-bearers advanced with their characteristic patience, confident that their blessed diseases would succeed where rage and sorcery had failed. They exhaled clouds of entropy, decay given airborne form, plagues that could rot adamantium and corrupt reality itself. The diseases died before reaching Spawn, simply ceased to function, their cycles of infection and multiplication ending abruptly as if they'd encountered something so fundamentally opposed to their nature that existence rejected the paradox by choosing Spawn's side. A great unclean one, a greater demon of Nurgle, its bloated form a mountain of rotting flesh and cheerful malevolence, emerged from the warp rift with a jovial laugh, ready to embrace this new soul in grandfather's loving decay. Spawn's chains caught it by what might have been a throat, lifting the multi-ton demon as if it weighed nothing. "No," Spawn said, his first word in hours, and it carried absolute finality. The great unclean one's laughter stopped. It felt itself being drained, not of life it had no life to take but of existence itself. The necroplasm was feeding on its essence, consuming the fundamental warp stuff that comprised its being. In his garden, Nurgle felt the death of one of his favored children and wept genuine tears. Not tears of sadness, the plague lord loved all endings as much as beginnings, but tears of confusion. Death was supposed to be part of the cycle. This was removal from the cycle entirely. The Soul Grinders opened fire, their cannons unleashing blasts of warp energy and physical ammunition designed to level fortifications. The barrage struck Spawn directly, engulfing him in explosions that vaporized the ferrocrete floor and sent shockwaves through the transit station. The civilians screamed and covered their heads, certain they were about to die. The smoke cleared. Spawn stood exactly where he'd been, his armor unmarked, his cape spread wide in a protective barrier that had absorbed the entirety of the assault. Behind him, the 300 civilians were untouched. He looked at the Soul Grinders with those burning hollow eyes, and for the first time, the demon engine's machine spirits experienced an emotion they were not programmed to understand: fear. Spawn moved, not toward the Soul Grinders but through them. He crossed the distance in a blur of necroplasmic speed, his chains already reaching out. A Soul Grinder tried to swat him with its massive claw limb that could crush battle tanks. Spawn caught the claw in mid-swing and tore it off. The demon engine's scream was half mechanical screech, half psychic wail. Spawn climbed the Soul Grinder like a soldier scaling a fortress wall, drove his fist through its armored carapace, and ripped out the demon core at its center. The core pulsed in his grip, trying to disperse back into the warp. Spawn crushed it. The Soul Grinder collapsed, not just destroyed but erased. Its components didn't scatter to be recovered and rebuilt. They simply unmade themselves, existence deciding that if the demon core no longer existed, neither could the shell it had inhabited. 5 more Soul Grinders met the same fate in 90 seconds. The warp rift, that gaping wound in reality, began to close. Not naturally but forcefully, as if the Immaterium itself was pulling back from this engagement, withdrawing from a confrontation it couldn't win. The remaining demons, perhaps 50 bloodletters, a handful of horrors, a shambling group of plague-bearers, did something that violated their fundamental nature. They retreated. They fled back through the closing rift, abandoning the assault, abandoning their mission to reclaim or destroy this anomaly. For the first time in the galaxy's recorded history, Chaos forces retreated not because they were being overwhelmed by superior numbers, not because of strategic necessity, but because they were afraid. The rift sealed with a sound like a wound closing, leaving behind only ash and silence. Spawn stood in the ruined transit station, surrounded by the scattered remains of demon weapons that were already fading from reality, having lost the warp energy that sustained them. Behind him, 300 civilians stared in absolute silence. One child girl no more than 8, her face streaked with grime, and tears stepped forward. "Thank you," she whispered. Spawn looked at her. For a moment, something in those hollow burning eyes might have softened, might have remembered being human, being a father, being something more than a weapon forged in hell. Then he turned and walked deeper into the hive, toward the sounds of distant combat, toward the next fight. The civilians followed. And in the warp, in those impossible domains where the Chaos gods brooded over their eternal games, a consensus formed. This being was not a weapon to be reclaimed. It was a threat to be eliminated. But for the first time in their timeless existence, the ruinous powers were not certain they could eliminate it. Chaos had learned something humanity had known for millennia. Some damnations run deeper than gods can fathom. The Black Templars arrived like the Emperor's wrath given Form 3 squads of Adeptus Astartes, their black armor adorned with white crosses and purity seals, their faith absolute and their purpose singular. Marshal Godron stood 9 feet tall in his Terminator plate, a veteran of 200 years of crusading. A warrior who had slain demon princes and Xenos warlords without hesitation. He looked upon the picked feeds of the anomaly and saw only one truth. Deviation from the Emperor's light was heresy, regardless of outcome. "The creature has killed our enemies," his Castellan observed, reviewing tactical data as their Thunderhawk descended toward Tertium Prime's war-torn surface. "It has preserved Imperial citizens. Its actions, if not its nature, serve the Imperium." "Its actions are irrelevant," Godron replied, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that made the Black Templars the Imperium's most zealous chapter. "Salvation without faith is corruption. We do not measure righteousness by results, but by adherence to the Emperor's will. This entity operates outside his light. Therefore, it must be brought to compliance or destroyed." They found Spawn in the ruins of a cathedral district, standing before a refugee column of nearly 2,000 souls. The civilians were exhausted, starving, traumatized but alive, guided through chaos-held territory by the silent figure who asked nothing of them except that they follow. The Thunderhawk's arrival scattered debris with its thrusters, and the Templars deployed with the practiced efficiency of warriors who had fought together for decades. Godron stepped forward, his storm bolter held ready but not yet aimed, his voice amplified by his armor's vox grills. "Anomaly, by the authority of the God Emperor of mankind and the sacred oaths of the Black Templars, you will submit to Imperial custody for classification and judgment." Spawn turned slowly, his cape settling around him like living shadow. He looked at the Space Marines with those hollow burning eyes and said nothing. "You have interfered in the Emperor's domain," Godron continued. "You have acted without sanction, without faith, without acknowledging the authority that governs mankind. Your existence is aberration. Speak, creature. Explain yourself or be destroyed." For a long moment, silence held the ruined plaza. The refugees behind Spawn huddled together, sensing the tension, understanding that something terrible was about to happen. Then Spawn spoke, his voice carrying the rasp of someone who had screamed in hell until his throat turned to ash and then kept screaming anyway. "I don't answer to emperors." The words landed like a physical blow. Several Templars raised their weapons reflexively. To deny the Emperor's authority was to deny humanity's salvation itself. Godron's face, visible through his helmet's faceplate, twisted with righteous fury. "Then you answer to his warriors." He opened fire. The Stormbolter's mass-reactive rounds crossed the distance in microseconds, each shell designed to penetrate armor and detonate inside the target. A barrage sufficient to destroy an Orc warboss or punch through armored vehicles. Spawn's cape whipped upward, forming a shield that caught the bolter rounds and absorbed them. The explosions bloomed across its surface like flowers of fire and fury, and the cape drank them down without mark or damage. "Brother Marshal," one of the Templars called. The entity, he didn't finish the sentence because Spawn moved. Not with the supernatural speed of a demon or the calculated precision of a weapon, but with the brutal efficiency of someone who had fought angels and devils and learned that divinity bled just as easily as anything else. Spawn crossed 30 meters in a heartbeat, his chains already extending. A Templar tried to intercept with his chainsword a blessed weapon that had tasted demon blood on 100 worlds. The chainsword shattered against Spawn's armor. The Templar followed a second later, struck by a backhand that sent him crashing through a ruined wall. The Space Marine rose immediately transhuman physiology and power armor, allowing him to shrug off impacts that would have killed baseline humans, but his armor was cracked, his helmet's optics sparking. 2 more Templars engaged simultaneously, their combat doctrines honed through centuries of war. They attacked in perfect coordination, one high and one low, their movements synchronized through helmet vox and instinct born of brotherhood. Spawn caught both their weapons mid-swing, one power sword, one thunder hammer, and held them. For 3 seconds, transhuman strength augmented by power armor strained against whatever unholy power animated this entity. Then Spawn pushed, and both Space Marines staggered backward, their weapons torn from their grips. Godron watched his brother's warriors who had never faltered, never shown weakness, being matched by a single entity, and felt something he had not experienced in 2 centuries, doubt. Not doubt in the Emperor, never that, but doubt in his assessment of this threat. "Terminate with extreme prejudice," he roared, and the remaining Templars opened fire in unison. Bolter fire, plasma blasts, and melter beams converged on Spawn's position. The firepower would have erased a squad of Chaos Marines or leveled a fortification. Spawn's necroplasm flared, forming a cocoon around him that absorbed and dispersed the energy. When the barrage ended, he stood unmarked, his armor gleaming with absorbed power. But he hadn't counterattacked. Godron realized it suddenly. The entity wasn't trying to kill them. It was defending, matching their aggression but not escalating beyond necessity. "Hold fire," Godron commanded. The Templars obeyed instantly, though their weapons remained trained on the anomaly. Spawn stood in the center of the plaza, surrounded by Space Marines, his cape spread wide and his chains coiled defensively. He looked at Godron, and for the first time, the Marshal saw something in those burning eyes that made him reassess everything. Not malice, not hunger, not the predatory intelligence of chaos or the cold calculation of Xenos. Exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of someone who had been fighting for so long that fighting had become his natural state, and peace was just a concept from a life he could barely remember. "I don't want your war," Spawn said quietly. "I don't want your crusade. I don't want worship or allegiance or souls. I just want them." He gestured toward the refugees to live. "Is that so incompatible with your Emperor's will?" Godron stood silent. In his 200 years of service, he had never been asked such a question by an enemy, because the question implied common ground, shared purpose, the possibility that righteousness could exist outside the Imperium's doctrine. It was the most dangerous heresy he had ever encountered. "The Emperor's will and human survival are inseparable," Godron finally said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "You cannot serve one without acknowledging the other. Then your Emperor is welcome to save them himself," Spawn replied. "Until he does, I will." The challenge hung in the air, not aggressive, but absolute. A line drawn not in conquest, but in simple refusal to abandon the helpless. Godron made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his service. He lowered his storm bolter. "Fall back," he commanded his brothers. "We withdraw. Marshal, the creature, is protecting Imperial citizens with a dedication that shames our own recent efforts in this sector," Godron interrupted. "We came to eliminate a threat. I see no threat here. Only a warrior doing what we claim to do, defending humanity." The Templars withdrew, but not in defeat. In confusion, in reassessment, in the uncomfortable recognition that perhaps their understanding of righteousness was less absolute than they had believed. As their Thunderhawk lifted off, Godron looked back at the figure standing before the refugee column, and allowed himself a thought that was nearly heretical. If the Emperor truly protected all mankind, perhaps protection could come from unexpected sources. Perhaps faith and salvation were not as indivisible as doctrine claimed. Spawn watched the Space Marines depart, then turned back to the refugees and gestured forward. They followed, as they always did, and across the planet, scattered Imperial and Chaos forces alike received reports of the confrontation, each interpreting it through their own lens of faith or corruption. But one truth emerged that neither side could deny. An angel of the Emperor had met a devil who refused to bow, and neither had been able to break the other. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, that counted as something almost miraculous. The order came through encrypted astropathic channels, sealed with inquisitorial authority and countersigned by 3 members of the Ordo Malleus High Council. Tertium Prime was condemned, not for falling to chaos. Worlds fell every day, and some could be reclaimed. Not for the deaths of billions. Such numbers were tragic but statistically acceptable in a galaxy measured in quadrillions of souls. No, Tertium Prime was condemned because salvation without sanction was more dangerous than damnation itself. Inquisitor Vogue read the order in the command bunker buried 3 kilometers beneath the planet's surface, his augmetic eye processing the text while his organic eye tracked the tactical displays showing Spawn's continued progress through the lower hive. The anomaly had saved 14,000 Imperial citizens in the past 36 hours. 14,000 souls who should have died screaming in chaos's embrace, now huddled in secured zones, traumatized but alive. It was the greatest humanitarian success Tertium Prime had seen since the invasion began, and it was the very reason the planet had to burn. "The order is clear," Cardinal Militant Severin said, his voice carrying satisfaction barely disguised as solemn duty. "Exterminatus protocols are authorized. The anomaly has become a cult of personality. Citizens worship it above the Emperor. That cannot stand." "They don't worship it," Vogue said quietly, still staring at the displays. "They follow it because it protects them. That's not worship, that's survival instinct." "The distinction is meaningless," Severin countered. "Faith is tested in crisis. These citizens should have prayed to the Emperor and accepted death if he willed it. Instead, they placed their hope in an entity that offers nothing but false salvation. They have failed the test. The mercy we offer is to end their suffering before they fall further into corruption." Vogue wanted to argue, wanted to point out that the civilians following Spawn hadn't rejected the Emperor, they'd simply accepted help from the only source offering it. That choosing to live when death seemed certain wasn't heresy, it was the most human thing imaginable. But he was Inquisitor, not philosopher. His authority came from the Imperium, and the Imperium had spoken. "Prepare the cyclonic torpedoes," he ordered, his voice hollow. The tactical officer paled. "My lord, there are still 3 million Imperial citizens on this world. Guard regiments, support personnel, civilian refugees are already considered acceptable losses," Vogue interrupted. "Tertium Prime is forfeit. The anomaly cannot be allowed to continue its operations. If it can save 14,000, it might save millions. And if millions are saved by something other than the Emperor's grace, the foundations of faith itself begin to erode." He paused, hating every word. Better 3 million die as martyrs than survive to spread doubt. The order went out. Imperial forces had 6 hours to evacuate whoever could reach the extraction points. Everyone else was collateral damage. In the lower hive, Spawn was unaware of the condemnation falling from orbit like the sword of an angry god. He moved through a residential sector that had somehow survived the chaos invasion mostly intact, leading his growing column of refugees toward what his symbiote's enhanced senses indicated was a defensible position. Behind him, the crowd had swollen to nearly 20,000. Word had spread through the hive's shattered Vox network and desperate whisper chains. "Follow the dark figure, and you might live. Stay behind, and chaos would find you." They weren't wrong. A young woman, Lieutenant Kessa of the Planetary Defense Forces, her uniform torn and her las rifle out of ammunition, worked her way to the front of the column. She'd been following the anomaly for 2 days, organizing the refugees, keeping order, doing what she could to help. "Entity," she called out, using the term she'd heard Imperial Command using. "Entity, we need to stop soon. People are collapsing from exhaustion. Children can't keep this pace." Spawn stopped walking and turned to face her. She'd expected those burning eyes to be terrifying up close, and they were, but there was something else there too. Something that understood exhaustion, understood being pushed beyond the limits of endurance. He nodded and gestured toward a large structure ahead, an abandoned administratum, building that would provide shelter. Kessa allowed herself a moment of relief before her Vox bead crackled to life. She'd thought it was dead, the battery drained days ago, but somehow it activated. "All Imperial personnel, this is Inquisitorial Command. Tertium Prime has been designated for exterminatus under Ordo Malleus authority. Evacuation is authorized for the next 6 hours. Extraction zones are being transmitted now." Any personnel or civilians not evacuated within the window will be considered lost. The Emperor protects. The transmission cut off. Kessa stood frozen, the words not quite processing. Then their meaning crashed over her like a physical weight. They were going to destroy the planet. Kill everyone still on it. In 6 hours. She looked at the 20,000 refugees behind her. Most had no vox beads, hadn't heard the transmission. They were settling down to rest, believing they'd finally found safety. 6 hours to evacuate 20,000 people to extraction zones that were probably hundreds of kilometers away through chaos-held territory. It was impossible. Kessa turned to Spawn, who was watching her with those burning eyes. Had he heard? Could he understand what exterminatus meant? "They're going to kill us," she said, her voice breaking. "The Imperium. They're going to burn the planet, everyone on it. All of us." For a long moment, Spawn said nothing. Then his cape spread wide, forming a protective canopy over the nearest refugees, as if shielding them from rain that hadn't yet fallen. "No," he said simply. "You can't stop exterminatus," Kessa whispered. "Nothing can. Cyclonic torpedoes will crack the planet's crust. The atmosphere will ignite. This world will die." "I've stood in hell's furnaces," Spawn replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I've burned in fires that make your Emperor's wrath look like candles. I didn't break there. I won't break here." He looked up, toward a sky he couldn't see through kilometers of hive structure, toward an orbit where weapons of planetary destruction were being prepared. "Get everyone to shelter," he commanded. "Reinforce structures, deep as possible. That won't matter against. It will matter if I'm standing between them and the fire." Kessa understood then. This entity, this thing that had slaughtered demons and walked through chaos invasions like they were inconvenient, weather was going to try to shield them. All of them. 20,000 souls against weapons designed to exterminate billions. It was insane. It was impossible. But looking into those burning eyes, seeing the absolute refusal to abandon the helpless even in the face of certain annihilation, Kessa felt something she hadn't felt since the chaos invasion began. Hope. She turned to the refugees and began organizing them, directing them into the strongest structures, getting children and elderly into the deepest levels, preparing for the fire that would fall from the sky. Above, in orbit, the Imperial Navy's Retribution-class battleship Adamantine Resolve loaded its exterminatus weapons, cyclonic torpedoes, each one capable of triggering tectonic collapse on a planetary scale. 6 of them, enough to crack tertium prime like an egg and ensure nothing survived. The captain, a veteran of 40 years' service, authorized the launch sequence and whispered a prayer for the souls below. "The Emperor forgives," he said, completing the ritual. In the hive below, Spawn stood before 20,000 refugees and prepared to do what he'd always done. Refuse to let innocent people die, no matter what power demanded it. He had defied hell. The Imperium's wrath would be no different. The countdown began. 5 hours, 59 minutes until exterminatus. The cyclonic torpedoes never launched. Not because the Imperium showed mercy. Mercy was a luxury the galaxy's cruelest regime could not afford, but because at T-2 hours to exterminatus, something happened that the Imperium's tactical cogitators couldn't predict, and the Inquisition couldn't comprehend. Spawn went on the offensive. Not against the Imperium they were, in his assessment, misguided but not fundamentally evil. They were humans trying to survive in a universe designed to devour them. Fanatics, certainly. Brutal, absolutely. But understandable in their desperation. Chaos was different. Chaos was hell wearing a different mask, and Spawn had been fighting hell since the moment he woke in his grave. In the deepest reaches of Tertium Prime's underhive, where the warp rifts had festered like infected wounds, where demon princes held court and cultist armies gathered for the final assault on the planet's last strongholds, Spawn arrived like vengeance incarnate. He didn't announce himself, didn't declare his intentions. He simply began killing, and he didn't stop. A warp rift, a tear in reality 300 meters wide, through which demons had been pouring for weeks, was his first target. He approached it while lesser demons swarmed him, and his cape exploded outward into a forest of spikes and blades that slaughtered everything within 20 meters. Then he reached into the rift itself. His necroplasm touched the Immaterium, and reality screamed. The warp recoiled from the contact, the way flesh recoils from acid, trying to pull away, but Spawn's chains followed, burrowing into the psychic wound like parasites finding a host. And then he pulled. Not just closed, the rift collapsed it permanently. The necroplasm spread through the dimensional tear like a cancer, consuming the warp stuff that sustained it, devouring the emotional energy that kept the wound open. Within seconds, the rift convulsed, contracted, and sealed itself with a sound like bone snapping. In the warp, the Chaos Gods felt it. A rift permanently closed, not banished temporarily, not sealed with wards that could be broken, erased from existence as if it had never been. It was impossible. It was happening. Spawn moved to the next rift, and the next, and the next. Each one collapsed with the same terrible finality, each closure sending shockwaves through the Immaterium that made the Chaos God's domains tremble. The demon princes on Tertium Prime rallied to stop him. 7 of them ancient warriors who had abandoned their humanity millennia ago for the gifts of the Dark Gods, who commanded legions and had raised worlds. They fell in 17 minutes. The first demon prince, its former grotesque fusion of Nurgle's blessings, attacked with plagues that could kill gods. Spawn walked through the disease cloud and drove his fist through the demon prince's chest, his necroplasm spreading like infection through the creature's warp-animated body. The demon prince tried to regenerate, pulling power from Nurgle's garden to rebuild its shattered form. Spawn's symbiote consumed the connection, severed it, and devoured the essence that remained. The demon prince died truly, permanently, its soul not returning to the warp but simply ceasing to exist. In his garden, Nurgle felt the loss and wept genuine grief. A favored son, gone not into new cycles but into nothing. A cormate demon prince, its brass armor fused to flesh that remembered being Astartes, attacked with a demon blade that had tasted 10,000 skulls. The blade struck Spawn's armor and shattered. The demon prince followed, torn apart by chains that moved faster than even transhuman perceptions could follow. Khorne roared in his brass citadel, the sound echoing across the warp, shaking the foundations of reality. Rage. Pure rage. But beneath the rage, something the blood god had not felt in eons. Concern. A Tsindkian demon prince tried to outsmart the threat, weaving temporal paradoxes and probability matrices designed to trap Spawn in loops of causality from which escape was mathematically impossible. Spawn broke mathematics. His existence simply refused to cooperate with the demon prince's calculations. Every spell cast created unexpected results. Every prediction failed. The demon prince, whose entire power base rested on understanding and manipulating fate, found itself facing something that fate couldn't account for. When the chains caught it, the demon prince's final thought was a question it could never answer. How? Tzint, in his crystal labyrinth, calculated and recalculated, his infinite eyes processing infinite possibilities. In every projection, every timeline, every possible future, the same conclusion emerged. This being was a variable that broke equations. The remaining demon princes attacked in concert, abandoning the Chaos God's eternal rivalries in favor of survival. Their combined assault should have overwhelmed any single entity, should have torn apart reality itself with its concentrated power. Spawn met them head-on, and the battle that followed was visible from orbit. Warp lightning and necroplasmic energy colliding in explosions that lit the Underhive like a second sun. When the battle ended, Spawn stood alone among ash that had once been demon princes. 7 irreplaceable commanders. 7 champions who had served chaos for thousands of years. Gone. Permanently. But Spawn wasn't finished. He began hunting warp rifts across the entire planet. Not just the major breaches, but every minor tier, every weak point where the Immaterium leaked into reality. His symbiote had learned the signature of warp corruption, could sense it from kilometers away, and Spawn moved with relentless efficiency. 53 rifts closed in the first hour. 112 in the second. By the fourth hour, Imperial sensors were detecting something they'd never witnessed. Warp presence on Tertium Prime was declining. Not stabilizing, declining. The planet was being actively cleansed of chaos corruption. In the command bunker, Inquisitor Voke watched the data streams with mounting disbelief. "This is impossible," the lead psyker whispered, her blind eyes wide with shock. "The warp doesn't retreat. It spreads, corrupts, consumes. It doesn't heal, but the psychic pressure on this world is decreasing. The entity is actively pushing chaos out of real space." Voke looked at the Exterminatus countdown, still ticking toward 0. The cyclonic torpedoes were loaded, the launch authority granted. But if the anomaly was genuinely purging chaos from Tertium Prime, accomplishing what entire Grey Knights brotherhoods couldn't achieve, then was Exterminatus still necessary? The question was heretical. The Inquisition had spoken. The planet was condemned. But Voke had not survived 3 decades of inquisitorial service by blindly following orders when reality presented contradicting data. "Hold Exterminatus protocols," he commanded. Cardinal Militant Severin erupted in fury. "You dare countermand the Ordo Malleus? This is treason. This is pragmatism," Voke replied coldly. "The anomaly is accomplishing our objective. Chaos is being purged. If we launch Exterminatus now, we destroy an asset actively fighting our enemy. Explain to the High Lords why we killed something that was winning." He turned to the tactical officer. "All forces, stand down from Exterminatus. Observe and reassess. If the anomaly fails, we can always burn the planet. But for now, we watch." In the warp, the Chaos Gods convened not in person, for their rivalry was too fundamental, but in awareness. They regarded the being currently tearing through their forces and spoke in languages that mortal minds couldn't survive hearing. The consensus was clear. This entity threatened the warp's fundamental dominance over real space. If it could permanently close rifts, permanently kill demons, permanently sever chaos's access to reality, it represented an existential threat. They had to destroy it. But they'd already tried, and they'd failed. For the first time since the War in Heaven, since the birth of Slaanesh, since the Long War began, the Chaos Gods felt something they inflicted on mortals but never experienced themselves. Doubt in victory's certainty. Spawn collapsed the final warp rift on Tertium Prime at hour 6, exactly when the Exterminatus would have launched. He stood on a promontory overlooking the Hive City, exhausted in ways that transcended physical fatigue, his symbiote gorged on consumed demon essence. Behind him, 20,000 refugees emerged from shelters, looking up at a sky where the warp storms were finally beginning to clear. They had survived. Chaos had lost a world not through imperial victory, but through the actions of a single damned soul who refused to stop fighting. In the warp, the ruinous powers retreated from Tertium Prime's vicinity, and the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath, as if wondering, what happens when hell discovers something worse than itself? 3 months after Tertium Prime, the Imperium officially declared the world under observation pending doctrinal review, which meant they hadn't decided what to do about it, so they did nothing. The anomaly, they never gave him another name, because naming something made it real in ways doctrine couldn't easily categorize. Vanished 2 weeks after the last warp rift closed. Spawn simply walked into the darkness beyond the Hive's outer walls and didn't return. The refugees he'd saved were integrated back into Imperial society, but not without consequence. Every single one was marked in inquisitorial records, flagged, watched. Their children and grandchildren would be watched. Association with the anomaly was a stain that water couldn't wash away, but they lived, and they remembered. Reports began filtering through Imperial intelligence networks, fragmentary, unconfirmed, but persistent. Sightings in the Imperium Nihilus, that dark half of the galaxy cut off by the Great Rift. A dark figure appearing during chaos incursions, slaughtering demons with permanent finality, then vanishing before Imperial forces could respond. A world besieged by Nurgle's plague fleet suddenly found its infection rates dropping, demons retreating, and a trail of ash leading away from the largest warp rift. Survivors spoke of a dark angel who wore no aquila and asked for no prayers. A Black Legion assault on an agri-world ended abruptly when something tore through their demon engine support column, destroyed 3 chaos sorcerers, and collapsed the warp rift they'd been using for reinforcements. The Black Legion abandoned the campaign not defeated, but unwilling to face whatever had declared war on chaos itself. The Inquisition tried to track the anomaly, spent resources trying to predict its movements, to contain it, to finally bring it to compliance or destruction. They failed. Spawn moved through the Imperium Nihilus like a ghost, appearing wherever chaos festered strongest, striking without warning, and disappearing before consequences could find him. He accepted no allies, acknowledged no authority, claimed no territory. He was simply there, then gone, leaving behind saved lives and permanent demon corpses. The Imperium branded him a myth. Safer to deny his existence than admit salvation could come from outside the Emperor's grace. Official records listed the victories as spontaneous warp regression or unexplained chaos retreat. The The people who survived knew better, but who would believe them? In the warp, the Chaos Gods learned to avoid regions where the anomaly operated. Not retreat. The ruinous powers didn't retreat, but they focused their efforts elsewhere, on softer targets, on worlds where their eternal dominance remained unchallenged. They told themselves it was strategic reallocation. It was fear. One being, one impossibly stubborn soul who had looked at hell and the warp and refused to bow to either, had carved out dead zones in Chaos's influence where demons whispered his designation like a curse. The unkillable, the void that devours, the dark saint who offers no salvation. Spawn didn't care what they called him. On a world whose name he never learned, in a refugee camp huddled beneath a sky still scarred by healing warp rifts, he sat in the darkness and looked at his hands. These instruments of violence, these weapons he'd been reforged into, how many had he killed? In his old life, in Hell's War, and now in this nightmare galaxy where suffering was industrialized. Thousands? Millions. He'd stopped counting the same way he'd stopped hoping for redemption. But the faces of the survivors, the children who'd looked at him without fear, the soldiers who'd followed him without faith, the civilians who'd chosen life over martyrdom, those he remembered. Al Simmons had died wanting to protect his family. Spawn had been resurrected as a weapon of damnation. And now, in a galaxy that made hell look like a moral kindergarten, he'd somehow become the thing he'd always been supposed to be. A soldier who protected the helpless, not because God demanded it, not because hell commanded it, not because the Emperor required it, because it was right. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, where faith was measured in corpses, and hope was just another word for heresy, one damned soul walked alone. He would never be redeemed, never be welcomed, never be understood, but he would never stop. The Imperium could brand him heresy. Chaos could hunt him across the stars. The galaxy itself could conspire to break him. It wouldn't matter. Spawn had learned something in his centuries of damnation, something that hell couldn't burn out and the warp couldn't corrupt. The universe didn't get to decide what you were worth. Only you decided that. And he had decided, somewhere between New York's alleys and the Immaterium storms, that he was worth exactly as much as he could save. So he rose from his vigil, his cape settling around him like living night, his chains coiling in anticipation of the next battle. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was screaming. Somewhere, chaos was feeding. Somewhere, innocents were dying while gods and emperors played their eternal games. Spawn walked toward the screaming. Not because he could save everyone. He couldn't. The galaxy was too vast, too cruel, too utterly consumed by its own apocalypse. But he could save someone. And in the end, that was enough. The devil the galaxy could not break walked into darkness, and the darkness learned, as hell had learned before it. Some damnations are stronger than any power that tries to wield them.